Thank you for joining me today. A quick note before I begin. I had hoped to be able to include several images in my presentation today, but was not able to do so due to technical limitations. So I want to provide you with a web address where I will be including several images that relate to this topic. And that address is www.class, that's C-L-A-S, .ufl.edu/users/Harland J, Harlandj. Today I want to talk to you about the history of Freemasonry and imperialism. This is a huge topic. As you may know, I wrote a book on the subject of Freemasonry in the British Empire, and I still feel like I only scratched the surface. So I want to use one theme to touch on several aspects of the complex reciprocal relationship between Freemasonry and imperialism. It's a theme that's relevant to you, not only as Masons in 2011, but also as citizens of the world, as an 18th century person would have said, as cosmopolites. This theme is globalization. Globalization is one of today's most frequently cited buzzwords. It's regularly bandied about on the radio, on TV, and of course on the web. Few take the time, though, to define what they mean by globalization. And as my students will tell you, I feel strongly about providing definitions for contested terms. So let me give you my definition, drawn from much reading on the subject. Globalization is the process by which the world has become increasingly interrelated and interconnected over time. It is connectivity on a global scale. Now, a lot of people have pretty strong opinions about globalization. Some argue that it is a good thing. Advocates of free trade, for example, see globalization as a positive, progressive force, generating employment and ultimately raising standards of living worldwide. Others argue that globalization is a bad thing. They see it as a means of expropriating resources of poor countries, of exploiting labor, and of causing environmental degradation. While people can have very different opinions about whether globalization is a positive or a negative development, most of us can agree that it is a reality of our times. It's hard to deny the fact that something is happening to make the world seem like a smaller place. Air travel, cell phones, the internet, and social networking, all these technologies are connecting people in ways previously unimagined. In fact, we tend to think of globalization as a phenomenon of our times, that we are experiencing something unprecedented, that it is a recent and fairly drastic development. But I want to argue that globalization is not a new thing. It has a history. The extraordinary interconnectivity that we are experiencing today represents the elaboration of processes and movements that have been at work for hundreds of years. And I will argue Freemasonry has something to do with that history. Most scholars and commentators who work on globalization focus on economics. They investigate global exchanges of capital and commodities. Or they talk about demographic flows, disease transmission, and technology. Few have taken into consideration the cultural and intellectual history of globalization. And by intellectual history, historians mean the history of ideas. As historian Tony Ballantyne has pointed out, quote, "On the few occasions it has entered the historical literature on empire, globalization has been interpreted in a narrowly economistic fashion. The cultural aspects of imperial globalization remain largely unexplored," end quote. But as you will see, Freemasonry, a socio-cultural institution par excellence, has made a significant, multifaceted contribution to globalization. It did so in several important ways: by achieving a global presence, by fostering global awareness, and by facilitating long-distance networking. I will examine each of these in turn, drawing evidence from several European empires, but focusing on the British Empire because that is the case that I know best. I will also be focusing chronologically on the period between the mid-18th century and the mid-19th century, a particularly important period in the history not only of globalization and of empires, but also of Freemasonry. As noted, the first way that Freemasonry contributed to globalizing the world was by achieving global extensity. In other words, it achieved a simultaneous presence in many parts of the world. Spreading worldwide during the 18th century, Freemasonry was one of the first cultural institutions to operate on a global scale. The Jesuits, as an aside, were arguably the first. So how did Freemasonry achieve a global presence in an era before the development of modern communications and transport systems? The institutionalization of British Freemasonry, and by that I mean speculative Freemasonry's emergence as a discrete public institution with a centralized administration, was crucial. Freemasonry's institutionalization, begun during the second decade of the 18th century, coincided with the expansion of the British Empire. In many ways, Freemasonry and the British Empire grew up together. So from the beginning, British Freemasonry was attuned to the possibilities of global expansion, and it developed several characteristics that enabled it to spread around the world. First, it was organized and administered as a network. A network is an interconnected system, an interrelated group of people who share interests and concerns and interact for mutual assistance. In the case of Freemasonry, the network's most basic unit was the local lodge. Provincial Grand Lodges were its coordinated regional nodes, and the Grand Lodges of England, Ireland, and Scotland constituted the network's central hub. During the middle decades of the 18th century, the activities of these Grand Lodges turned speculative Freemasonry into a readily identifiable institution with standardized policies and procedures, outlined for the first time in Anderson's Constitutions of 1723. When a new lodge emerged, it became part of an ever-growing network that contemporaries readily recognized as Masonic. Second, Freemasonry's metropolitan administration proved quite adaptable. As the Brotherhood grew in popularity, it became vulnerable to impostors. To address this problem, the Grand Lodge of Ireland began issuing certificates to individual brethren. A stranger could prove his membership in the Brotherhood by producing this certificate, or passport if you will, as well as by demonstrating his knowledge of Masonic symbols, hand grips, passwords, and of course rituals. The Grand Lodge of Ireland was also the first Grand Lodge to issue warrants to lodges, and they did this in order to help them keep track of the growing number of Irish lodges. This brings me to the third characteristic that allowed Freemasonry to spread worldwide: administrative mechanisms that were specifically imperial in nature that made it possible for the network to proliferate. By far the most important was the ambulatory or military lodge, which met under what was known as a traveling warrant. The very first traveling warrant was issued by the Grand Lodge of Ireland in 1732 to the 1st Battalion Royal Scots. The warrant gave members of the lodge the authority to meet anywhere they were stationed in the world. Between 1732 and 1813, the Irish issued warrants to nearly 200 such lodges. They were by far the most active in this regard. The ancient Grand Lodge of England, which had been formed as a rival to the original English Grand Lodge in the 1750s, was next with 108 traveling warrants. Nearly every regiment in the British Army had at least one Masonic lodge in its ranks. Many had several. For example, four regiments, the 1st, the 17th, the 23rd, and the 51st Foot, had each at least one Irish, Scottish, and English lodge. The Royal Artillery Regiment had 28 ancient lodges. The estimate for the total number of military lodges is about 500. As Irish Masonic historian Chetwood Crawley put it, quote, "These lodges permeated everywhere. Everywhere they left behind the germs of Freemasonry." End quote. The traveling lodges not only allowed Freemasons to meet anywhere in the world, they also planted Freemasonry abroad. When a regiment departed a garrison town or a colony, civilians who had been invited to participate in the military lodge would continue working and eventually request and receive their own warrant. For example, Irish Lodge No. 74 in the 2nd Battalion Royal was active in Albany, New York during the 1750s. The lodge initiated several townsmen into Freemasonry. Upon the regiment's transfer in 1759, the lodge informed Irish authorities that it had decided to copy its own warrant and leave it with the civilians so that they could work their own lodge. Quote, "Our body is very numerous by the addition of many members, merchants, and inhabitants of the city of Albany. They have earnestly requested and besought us to enable them to hold a lodge during our absence from them." End quote. Of course, copying a warrant was highly irregular, but nonetheless, the Grand Lodge of Ireland accepted the new lodge and sent its own new warrant, official warrant, across the Atlantic to allow the Albany Lodge to continue meeting. The other mechanisms that extended the Masonic network worldwide were provincial Grand Lodges and the processes of migration. Grand Lodges established provincial Grand Lodges wherever a strong Masonic presence had emerged, or wherever they anticipated Freemasonry would take off. The provincial Grand Master served as the Grand Master's representative in a locality, and he had the authority to warrant new lodges. The Provincial Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, for example, established 50 lodges in North America before the American War of Independence. In the 1770s, the Provincial Grand Master of Bengal, Samuel Middleton, had 12 lodges in his charge. Like other provincial Grand Masters, he was responsible for collecting fees, keeping registers, corresponding with the Grand Lodge in London, settling disputes, disciplining lodges and brethren, and when circumstances were right, setting up new lodges. The final mechanism that worked along with military lodges and provincial Grand Masters, or Grand Lodges, to spread Freemasonry abroad was emigration. If a Mason arrived at a destination and found no lodge existed, or determined that the lodges that were working there were too crowded, he could petition a European Grand Lodge to send a warrant for a new lodge. Many lodges in the Caribbean and in British North America, and later during the 19th century in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, were established in this manner. Thus, by the mid-18th century, Freemasonry developed a well-organized and adaptable administration and the ability to establish new lodges anywhere Britons found themselves. It was in an excellent position to respond to the opportunities for growth presented by the expansion of the British Empire during the second half of the 18th century. This was an era of aggressive imperialism, driven forward by commercial expansion, migration, and scientific exploration, perhaps best represented by the Captain Cook voyages, his 3 voyages into the Pacific in the late 1760s and 1770s. But the biggest single factor responsible for the growth of the British Empire in this period was international rivalry and warfare. The century witnessed a series of European wars that became increasingly colonial wars over time. Britain did well in these wars, and as a result took over many of the colonies of its rivals, France and Spain. Take, for example, the First World War. No, I'm not skipping ahead to the 20th century, but rather referring to the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. This is better known to students of American history as the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War was a colonial struggle between Britain and France in North America that escalated into a major European war, pitting Britain and Frederick the Great's Prussia against France, Austria, and Russia. For the first time in history, a war was fought simultaneously across many hemispheric fronts in Europe, Asia, and the Americas, thus the First World War. What's important for our purposes is not the causes of the war or the course of the war, but rather its outcome. After some initial setbacks, the British and their Prussian allies were victorious. There were minimal territorial shifts on the continent, but dramatic changes took place overseas as Britain emerged as the dominant commercial and naval and colonial power. When they signed the Treaty of Paris to end the conflict in 1763, the British took over Minorca in the Mediterranean, Grenada, Dominica, St. Vincent, and Tobago in the Caribbean, almost all of North America, including Canada, Florida, and territories east of the Mississippi River, and Senegal in Africa. Within 2 years, Britain would also succeed in chasing the French out of Bengal and establishing the foundations of a territorial empire in India. So this was a major turning point in the history of the British Empire. It was via this expanding empire that Freemasonry achieved global extensity. Let me track its spread around the world over the course of the 18th century. The first overseas lodges had emerged in Gibraltar and Calcutta in 1728-1729. By 1752, the Grand Lodges of England, Ireland, and Scotland had warranted lodges in the Caribbean and in 10 North American colonies. Provincial Grand Masters had been appointed in these regions as well. But the 1760s, which has aptly been described as a, quote, globalizing decade, end quote, marked the beginning of a period of remarkable growth. And remember, this coincided with the period of the 7 Years' War. Think about all the British regiments moving around the world during this time, and remember that most of these regiments had at least one Masonic lodge. Think about all the people on the move, the East India Company servants journeying out to Bengal, Scots-Irish settlers crossing the Atlantic, colonial governors moving from one colony to the next, especially Scots, like the first governor of British East Florida, James Grant, whom the Grand Lodge of Scotland appointed Provincial Grand Master over the lodges in the Southern District of North America. Thousands among them were Freemasons, and they planted Freemasonry wherever they went. To quote Ballantyne again, while many lands remained beyond British commercial influence or military power, by the 1780s British commercial factories, naval bases, and missionary stations encircled the world. End quote. To that list we must add Masonic lodges. Indeed, between the 1750s and the early 19th century, the British set up lodges in Madras, several additional American colonies, Bombay, Quebec, Honduras, Ontario, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and New South Wales. This period also witnessed British Freemasonry's export to areas outside the formal empire: Dutch Guiana, Sumatra, China, Florida, Ceylon, South Africa, and Argentina. In the words of one early 19th century member, his 18th century brethren had constructed, quote, a vast chain extending round the world, end quote. Meanwhile, Freemasonry had also spread to Europe and then, in various forms, into the empires of Britain's rivals, France, the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal. Though much research remains to be done on the topic, it appears that the regimental lodge was not as instrumental in spreading Dutch and French Freemasonry as it was in the British case. Merchant networks were significant vectors, as were provincial Grand Masters. And not surprisingly, Freemasonry arrived in the Dutch and French colonies slightly later than it did in the British colonies. In the Dutch case, multiple lodges were working in Suriname, in northern South America, from the 1760s. It was during the same decade that Dutch Freemasonry appeared in the East Indies, first in Batavia and then later in northeastern Java. There was a close, though understudied, connection between the Brotherhood and the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company. Company officials were active in lodges throughout the Indian Ocean basin, not only on Java, but also in Bengal, Ceylon, and the Cape. Masonic activity waxed and waned, to be sure, but there were enough lodges to warrant the appointment of deputy Grand Masters and the building of permanent lodge buildings. By the early 19th century, Dutch Freemasonry was solidly established in the East Indies, the Caribbean, and the Cape. Meanwhile, the Brotherhood was taking root in the colonies of France. Lodges were active on Martinique, Guadeloupe, St. Lucia, and French Guiana in the second half of the 18th century. The order became particularly well established in the flourishing French colony of Saint-Domingue, which was the world's principal sugar and coffee producer by the 1780s. Saint-Domingue is on the western half of the island of Hispaniola. The colony's substantial settler population gave rise to dozens of lodges and chapters in the period before the French Revolution, which of course broke out in 1789. As with the Dutch, French Freemasons were also active in the Indian Ocean region and in Africa, though in the north, not in the south. Thus, even though Britain had emerged as the world's preeminent colonial power by the early 19th century, and British lodges proliferated at a significantly greater rate than those of other jurisdictions, Freemasonry and colonialism were intimately connected in the Dutch and French cases as well. Also notable is the fact that British, Dutch, and French Freemasons, despite their nations' rivalries, often interacted as brethren, especially in the Indian Ocean region, and I'll give you an example of this in a moment. But let me summarize my argument thus far. Freemasonry contributed to the history of globalization by being one of the first cultural institutions to achieve a global presence, to have geographic extensity. Its geographic extensity is evident in the three European empires I have just briefly discussed. The fraternity gained this global presence as a result of actions taken by so-called men on the spot, merchants, soldiers, administrators, and colonists out in the empires, as well as the activities of the Grand Lodges in Europe. The British were especially innovative at developing mechanisms, such as the traveling warrant and the provincial Grand Lodge, that exported Freemasonry abroad. Freemasonry also contributed to the processes of globalization by fostering global awareness among its members. Before I talk about how Freemasons did this, a word on the broader context is in order. Awareness of the world in all its diversity was a key preoccupation of the Enlightenment, a period of European history that historians date from the end of the 1600s through the French Revolution in the 1780s. While we can trace Freemasonry's origins to an earlier period than the Enlightenment, it was really during the Enlightenment that Masonry, as we know it today, came into being and flourished. Historians used to describe the Enlightenment as an intellectual movement of prominent philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot, who developed and championed core ideas: reason, liberty, anti-clericalism, and progress. More recently, historians have begun to talk about the Enlightenment as a cultural movement, involving not only the great thinkers, but also an engaged public, composed of women as well as men, who socialized in salons, who wrote great quantities of pamphlets and books, who gathered in coffee houses and Masonic lodges, and who read everything they could get their hands on. They consumed a steady diet of travel literature, such as Montesquieu's Persian Letters and Voltaire's Letters on the English. They eagerly absorbed explorers' accounts of their discoveries, these extraordinary discoveries that they were making on the other side of the world. For example, the first edition of the narrative of Cook's third voyage sold out in 3 days. 18th century Europeans were obsessed with gathering information about man and the natural world, and they used this information to develop a much fuller and increasingly theorized picture of the world and human variety. Now, Freemasonry gave its members a way to think about the world as it came into focus for 18th century Europeans. It did so by promoting an ideology of cosmopolitan brotherhood. Now, by ideology, I just mean a system of ideas that informs the way people conceptualize the world and their place within it. A system that leads them to act in certain ways and that allows them to justify their actions. Freemasonry's ideology of cosmopolitan fraternalism was, I am arguing, a globalizing ideology, and it had several intersecting components. I'll go through each of these briefly, providing examples from the late 18th century. Freemasonry urged its members to practice toleration and inclusiveness, thus the ban on discussing politics and religion in the lodge. As English Freemasons explained to King George III in the turbulent 1790s, their rules forbade religious and political discussions because they, quote, sharpened the mind of man against his brother. Since their fraternity was composed of, quote, men of various nations professing different rites of faith and attached to opposite systems of government, end quote, they observed the Constitution's injunction to keep quarrels about religion or nations or state policy outside the lodge. And so during the 18th century, we have evidence of British lodges being relatively inclusive. Men of various religious, social, and political backgrounds sought and won admission into the brotherhood. In my book, I explore how 18th century Freemasonry included in its ranks not only Protestants, but also Catholics, Jews, and even some Muslims. Lodges were dominated by white European men, to be sure, but one occasionally finds Asians and Africans undergoing initiation, and Freemasonry is being celebrated for that fact. Joseph Brant, an Iroquois leader and ally of the British, was initiated into Freemasonry in London in 1776. That same year, across the world in southern India, a Muslim prince, the future Nawab of Arcot, became a Mason. Addressing the prince, the Grand Lodge of England observed, quote, "The good moral man of every country or denomination is qualified to participate in Masonry," end quote. Even some among the growing numbers of free blacks in North America were admitted into the brotherhood. This was the moment when Prince Hall and several other prominent African Americans in Boston were initiated by an Irish regimental lodge and subsequently recognized by the Grand Lodge of England as a legitimate lodge. Freemasonry's inclusiveness extended beyond religion and race to politics as well. 18th century lodges included men from across the political spectrum, from conservative loyalists like the men in charge of British Grand Lodges to hot-headed radicals like French Jacobins and United Irishmen, who rebelled against the British in 1798. Freemasons were instructed to be tolerant because all men belonged, the institution claimed, to a universal family, as they described it, quote, the common fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. This is the second aspect of Masonic ideology that fostered global awareness. Like many in the Enlightenment, Freemasons believed in the fundamental unity of mankind, also known as monogenesis, though of course they accepted the idea that the family of mankind was inherently hierarchical. It was not an institution of equals, in other words. One Masonic handbook from 1798 reminded its readers, quote, we are taught to regard the whole human species as one family, the high, low, rich, and poor, all created by one almighty being and sent into the world for the aid, support, and protection of each other. On this grand principle, Masonry unites men of every country, sect, and opinion. End quote. Freemasonry's claim to unite men of every country, sect, and opinion was frequently uttered. It was also, especially in the 19th century, frequently put to the test. With an open mind and an awareness that he was always among his brothers, the Mason was expected to feel at home in any part of the world. He was a cosmopolite, a citizen of the world. William Preston, whose illustrations of Freemasonry became a bestseller in England during the 18th century, continues to this day to come out in new editions, most recently in an electronic format, explained that Masonry, quote, unites men of the most opposite religions, of the most distant countries, and of the most contradictory opinions in one indissoluble bond of unfeigned affection, end quote. As a result of this fraternalism, he continues, quote, in every nation a Mason may find a friend, and in every climate he may find a home, end quote. The final component of Freemasonry's cosmopolitan fraternalism was the command to express love and practice benevolence. According to 18th century Masonic texts like the ones I've been quoting, the Masons should express love for his brethren and indeed to mankind in general. Brotherly love was a favorite topic of Masonic sermons during the 18th century. These sermons were usually delivered before Masons gathered in churches to celebrate the festival of St. John. Most Masonic pamphlets and tracts, and there were a lot of these published in the 18th and 19th century, also either touched on or alluded to the theme of brotherly love. A dissertation on Freemasonry explained, quote, united by the endearing name of brother, Freemasons live in an affection and friendship rarely to be met with even among those whom the ties of blood ought to bind in the firmest manner. Practicing brotherly love meant acting charitably, not only towards members of the brotherhood, but also toward the wider community. In the course of my research, I have come across countless examples of Freemasons extending relief to those in need, both inside and outside the brotherhood. I will discuss some of these examples in a moment when I turn my attention to the functions of Freemasonry's global network. These four strands, being tolerant, believing in a universal family, feeling at home anywhere in the world, and practicing brotherly love and benevolence, thus constituted the ideology I am describing as fraternal cosmopolitanism. We might also describe it as global fraternalism. In fact, fraternalism was really the key to Freemasonry's extensity, its ideology, and, as I will demonstrate in the next section of this talk, the functioning of the network itself. Fraternalism is the process by which biologically unrelated men undergo a shared ritual experience designed to create the bonds and obligations that supposedly characterize the relationship between actual brothers. In other words, fraternalism is symbolic kinship. Members viewed one another as brothers, connected by shared ritual experiences and pledges of mutual obligation. In the words of Professor Stephen C. Bullock, 18th century Freemasons had created a fictive family. To be sure, Freemasonry's ideology of cosmopolitan fraternalism was marked by limitations and tensions. While some others did find their way into Freemasonry, European men dominated lodge memberships, as I've said. Lodges could blackball a candidate they deemed unfit for whatever reason. In fact, the cosmopolitanism of the 18th century began to recede in the early decades of the 19th century. I don't have time to discuss this fully, but it's important to point out that British Freemasonry became increasingly exclusive, limiting membership to white, Protestant, middle and upper class men who were unquestionably loyal to the British state. As the 19th century proceeded, however, excluded groups such as blacks, Hindus and Parsis, and even women would begin calling on Freemasonry to live up to its claims of universal brotherhood. But, and this is the point that is most important for my argument about globalization, from the outset, Masonic ideology did encourage members to think beyond the local and the national to the global and to embrace others as brothers. So, Freemasonry helped make the world a more interconnected and interdependent place by achieving a global presence and by promoting an ideology of cosmopolitan brotherhood. The brotherhood also contributed to globalization by enabling men to network on a global scale. In this regard, Freemasonry was truly without precedent, and because of its success, it became a model for dozens of other institutions and organizations that would emerge in the modern era. The fraternal bonds forged in the lodge translated into many forms of mutual assistance that benefited men of low means, the highest ranking elites, and everyone in between. A good standing member's access to services was limited only by the extent of the network. As we have seen, this network stretched across much of the globe by the late 18th century. Contemporaries themselves were well aware of the global extent of Freemasonry's networks and what it had to offer men who were on the move. In 1785, the Reverend Joshua Weeks was speaking to Masons gathered in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He explained that as Freemasons they possessed a key that would give them admittance to the brotherhood anywhere in the world. He proclaimed, quote, "Were the providence of God to cast you on an unknown shore, were you to travel through any distant country, though ignorant of its language, ignorant of its inhabitants, and ignorant of its customs, this key would open the treasures of their charity." End quote. The following year, on the other side of the Atlantic, the Grand Lodge of England issued a circular to its subordinate lodges that revealed the profound accuracy of this statement from the preacher on the other side of the Atlantic in Nova Scotia. Grand Lodge officials warned the English brethren that, quote, "many idle persons travel about the country, some particularly in the dress of Turks or Moors, and under the sanction of certificates, and pretending to be distressed Masons, impose upon the benevolence of many lodges and brethren." End quote. Think about this. Freemasonry's reputation for taking care of its members had become so well known, and its network so extensive by 1786, that English impostors posed as Turks in order to gain access to Freemasonry's treasures. It was eminently useful and at times life-saving to be a Freemason. Membership indeed had its privileges. So, from the beginning, Freemasons were careful to guard their treasures by using passwords, hand grips, certificates, and knowledge of Masonic rituals. As with other aspects of Masonic administration, these helped Freemasonry function on a global scale, allowing members to recognize and receive one another as brethren. Once a man did establish his credentials as a legitimate Freemason, he could call on the global network to fulfill wide-ranging needs. These needs were particularly acute for men working and living in Europe's far-flung empires, for merchants, soldiers and sailors, surgeons, explorers, settlers, and colonial officials. Having left his kinship networks behind in Europe, a colonist found in Freemasonry an institution that provided him with opportunities for fellowship, growth, and recreation. It facilitated his travels and eased his adjustment to foreign environments. It gave him resources when he could not make ends meet. It helped him advance in the world. I have time for just a few examples. The Masonic network kicked into gear when natural disaster struck. In October 1789, a hurricane tore through Barbados. It left the prominent St. Michael's Lodge in a, quote, heap of ruins. Members of the lodge helped one another build temporary houses. They assisted one brother who had lost everything, and then they directed their remaining charity towards, quote, other poor Masons on the island. Prisoners of war benefited from belonging to the Brotherhood. English Freemasons in Bengal reported that members who had been captured by the French and imprisoned on the island of Réunion in the Indian Ocean were very well treated by French lodges. Their French brethren provided, quote, very handsome relief and assistance, and rendered their situation on the island pleasant and agreeable, end quote. In fact, one English Mason, writing from Madras, noted that French Freemasons' reputation for taking care of Masons among their POWs had, quote, reached the remotest parts of India and was responsible for increasing the number of our brethren throughout the British settlement. Lodges provided money and accommodations to brethren who had fallen on hard times. In the late 1780s, the Provincial Grand Lodge of Nova Scotia reported that it had given £365 to men they described as, quote, traveling brethren from England, Scotland, and Ireland, driven to distress by diverse misfortunes, in this distant part of His Majesty's dominion, far from their native homes, end quote. In this same period, Freemasons representing 3 lodges in Montreal established a permanent charity fund and purchased a house, quote, for the relief of necessitous brethren, end quote. The network helped needy brethren and their dependents get around the empire. Lodge funds were used to buy passages and even clothes for Masons who had met with misfortune and needed to get home or move to another part of the empire. The District Grand Lodge of Madras came to the aid of one brother, Victor Dumas, a veterinary surgeon who had come to Madras to practice his profession. He had been initiated in Mauritius and was a member of Lodge Shanghai No. 106. When Dumas could not find enough work, the District Grand Lodge of Madras covered the cost of his passage to Singapore and gave him money, quote, for his immediate wants. And as the near-constant warfare of the period took its toll, Masons paid increasing attention to vulnerable widows, orphans, and veterans. Lodges provided pensions to deceased brothers' widows, especially if they had children. And by the 19th century, Masonic orphanages began appearing in British India and in the Dutch East Indies, and the network responded to the needs of thousands of decommissioned soldiers. Thus, membership in Freemasonry eased the inherently risky nature of life and travel in this period. In the days before disability and life insurance, before governments helped their most needy citizens, voluntary associations were crucial for helping people cope with disease and disaster, with the vagaries of life. Freemasonry was among the first voluntary associations to perform these functions. It was certainly the first such institution to operate on a global scale. That said, the benefits of Freemasonry's global network were by no means restricted to brethren in dire circumstances. They also assisted middle-class men on the move, those literally moving to another part of the empire, as well as the upwardly mobile. Writing to the English Grand Lodge from New South Wales, a recently arrived colonist expressed optimism about Freemasonry's prospects in the colony because, quote, the greater part of the free community have been admitted as Masons in England from the prevailing notion of the necessity of being so on becoming travelers. To summarize that, he's basically saying that before you left England, you needed to be initiated as a Mason because it would help you as you moved around the world. Membership in Freemasonry facilitated one's social mobility in fluid colonial societies. Joining a lodge could help confer respectability on a man. It could ease his transition into middle-class or elite circles, and it could give him access to powerful social and political networks. The network helped men negotiate their professional as well as their personal lives, as evidenced by the circulation of recommendation letters throughout the Masonic world. Charles Stuart, returning to England after a stint in India, was accompanied by a letter from the Provincial Grand Lodge of Bengal, recommending him to the English Grand Master as, quote, a very worthy and benevolent man, and as a faithful and zealous Mason, end quote. Thus, by fulfilling a variety of needs, ranging from convivial association to easing men's transitions from one colonial society to another. Belonging to the fraternity made life easier for men who governed, defended, and lived in the British and other European empires. Let me sum up. Freemasonry made a multifaceted contribution to the history of globalization. It was one of the first cultural institutions to extend its reach across the world. It promoted an ideology of cosmopolitan brotherhood that taught members a particular way of thinking about the world. And it facilitated social mobility and global movement. In the process, Freemasonry helped lubricate several other agents of globalization, including trading networks, migration flows, and empires. And it did all this in the days before telegraphs and passports and steamships. All of these, telegraphs, passports, and steamships, would become standard features of the modern era. Like the jumbo jets and internet of our own age, they helped usher in a new phase in the history of globalization. In this increasingly industrialized and capitalist world, Freemasonry's global network continued to grow. Even more than before, Freemasons made their presence felt in nearly every corner of the world. They built permanent lodge buildings, marched in public processions, reported their meetings in newspapers, and published tracts for members and non-members alike. Their interconnectivity intensified as Grand Lodges began exchanging representatives and correspondence, and Masonic periodicals circulated news and discussions about the world of Masonry. In these periodicals and other venues, Freemasons continued to promote an ideology of cosmopolitan fraternalism, stressing openness, global brotherhood, global citizenship, and benevolence. And the brethren continued to benefit from all the fellowship and assistance their fraternity had to offer. There were divisions and controversies and distinctions within the brotherhood, to be sure. But what had started out as a rather informal gathering of 4 London lodges in 1717 had, in the period I've been exploring today, turned into an impressive fraternal network, both institutionalized and globalized. Freemasonry had indeed, as one contemporary put it, stretched to the ends of the earth, and in the process, it helped bring the earth's ends into enduring interconnection. Thank you.